So I'm here on behalf of Arista Software Masters, and my name is Chris. Unfortunately, our partner Trans.eu couldn't make it today, so I will try to fill in for them as good as I can. So the topic of this presentation is actually a case study of Trans.eu, but also I wanted to talk a bit about software house approach for Camunda development. And actually, I will present you two case studies in our issue. So as for the agenda, I will start to talk a bit about Trans.eu case study. This will be more of a technical part of our presentation. I saw that there are some developers here, so this would make more sense for them. And then I will try to talk a bit about how we implemented Camunda in our own internal system called Bookkeeping Assistant. And then I will summarize a bit the approach we've taken there. So let me start with introducing you to the Trans.eu system. Trans.eu is a logistic platform. It's called #1 trading logistic platform in the Europe. As we speak, there are over 100,000 users actively searching for trades, which part of them are shippers, carriers, forwarders. Currently, in our system, we have only over 40,000 registered companies and verified. So by the end of today, we're expecting that there will be over 400,000 deals sealed in our system in over 45 countries. So as you can imagine, the system is under quite a heavy rush. And it's based on Camunda. So what's the use of Camunda at Trans.eu? Well, the need for Camunda at Trans.eu was that there were a lot of manual tasks to be done by the consultants when taking care of customers. As we probably all know, human tasks are prone to errors, and such errors can be very costly, especially in cases where time matters. And this is a special case for the logistics business. Also, the human tasks for the consultants also tend to be very repetitive, which also does not help when it comes to reliability. And what we wanted to do is to transform all this stuff that humans do into process models. So the solution for our issue was warping the customer services into BPMN processes. The use of Camunda in this case was that it gave the company a nice overview of what's going on with each and every single process for each customer, but also an overview of what's going on in the system overall. This especially helped with the communication between customers and our customer service, but as well as communication between shipper, carriers, and forwarders. What also is the benefit of using Camunda in our system was that it gave us the possibility of improvement and optimization thanks to the tools like Optimize and History View. So I hope you have a small image of what Trans is. So let me introduce you to the problem we stumbled upon. So when we first started developing at Trans, we had this large-scale monolithic architecture system where everything was connected together, and nobody really had any control over the flow. So what we wanted to do is to set ourselves some goals. So our goals were to make this system, transform this system to something very scalable and reliable. So we decided to go into a microservice architecture. But then we came across some problems resulting from business specification we had and the loads to which the system was given. When we first started working on this system, there weren't so many daily users as 100,000, and this amount of load grew day by day. So we had to make something to ensure this reliability of the system. Which brings us to the problem. The problem was that in cases of processes defined by the business users, there were cases where some action needed to be taken upon receiving all information from external systems or users, which tend to be generated in very small amounts of time. So for example, in our microservice architecture, when we started implementing it, we didn't really thought this would be an issue. But with our architectural system, when we used Rabbit for synchronizing and message queuing, it turned out that if we deploy many consumers with the Camunda engine to consume these messages, if the messages come into very short intervals of time, it might happen that our consumers consume messages independently, which would result, in case of the process which I shown you before, in starting multiple instances of this for the same business key. What we can see here is that this process would start in case of receiving messages like invoice action taken, invoice state changed, and so on and so on. So the general idea behind this process was to listen for all three messages. But if we have three different consumers consuming these messages and they do not know about each other consuming another topic for the same business key, we would have three copies of the same process running concurrently, which is not something we want to have in our system. So for the solution that we first have attempted, this problem really existed. Then the solution. We started thinking about many different solutions for this problem, and I'm sure many of you will, if you have such business cases, you might stumble upon. So the solution was to introduce something called Consul. I don't know if you are familiar with this solution. It's very similar to something called the Zookeeper. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. No? Okay. So I'll briefly explain what Consul does. Well, basically, upon receiving or reading the message from the message queue, our consumers are asking some external system called Consul if they can get a log for this topic. And the topic is basically a message for the business key. So if they communicate via REST APIs, so the Consul receives such request, and since it's kind of an atomic semaphore, it creates a log for this particular topic. Well, when the other consumers also receive message regarding the same business key, they will also try to ask Consul if they can perform some actions regarding this business key, but they will not get an answer. They will be on hold. And only one consumer will receive a message that, yes, you get the log, you can proceed with everything you want to do. Then, whenever consumer A is done with its work, it will start the process, persist its state into the database, and it will inform the Consul that I'm done with this topic, you can increase the versioning, and then the Consul will respond to the other consumers asking for the topic, hey, this topic has changed, you can ask again for a log. And this is basically what creates, what allows us to process the queue independently of the consumers. Well, this solution was more of an architectural solution, which really resulted in the way that Camunda engine processes and are started and persisted into the database, so that the consumers cannot know what other process is started by the other consumer, which we hope ZB will solve soon. But this is not the topic for today. When we implemented this solution, we saw that it brings a lot of joy and improvements into Trans.eu. So we decided let's use Camunda to solve our own issues. What we did was ask around in our organization what hurts them the most in day-by-day work, what tasks are most boring, where they have a lot of manual labor, where group-by-group communication is required. And we decided that this is a perfect case to refresh our application stack. So we had three candidates. We had the process of selling services, the product rollouts, and the invoicing and debt collection. Well, we decided we will tackle the problem of invoicing and debt collection, and there were few arguments behind it. Well, every company has some flow addressing this issue. This is basically the everything that makes company works is money. So everyone wants to collect their money and invoice its customers. Also, this process, as it turned out, required a lot of manual labor, group-to-group communication, and task scheduling. In the process of investigating this topic, we found out that there are some external services we need to communicate with, like Saldeo or Optima, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Because of this, we decided we'll tackle this problem. Also, we had another goal in our minds when starting this. We wanted to standardize the process of Camunda development in the products we provide. So we started to discussing things. We gathered around people from our business unit responsible for the process itself, and the developers and the leads of architects who can discuss the solution. Well, as it turned out, there were some issues with the communication. On the first meeting we had, the biggest thing we stumbled upon was the language barrier. Many cases that business users were talking about were not so clearly understood and visible for the developers. So we decided to tackle this problem first. So what we did was we organized something like a workshop where we decided that we want to establish some common language. In our case, and the case of Camunda itself, it was the BPM notation. So on this workshop, we needed to make sure that every user from the business and from the technical team understands how to read the business model diagrams. We started drawing. On this workshop, we also needed to introduce the business users of the idea of working with tasks. Many of the users, of the business users, didn't really see clearly how should it work, what's the flow, how the external users will operate the application. So we had to introduce them to the Camunda cockpit and how it works there. So when the picture was clear and we had the common ground to understand one another, we decided to start drawing. On this workshop, we created on the whiteboard something like this. This does not tell much yet, but we were drawing it so long until everyone reached a common understanding of what needs to be done, what the system needs to perform. With the BPMN drawing, we could create a general overview of the model. Then in the next step, we started the digitalization. So what we did was just taking this model from the whiteboard and recreating it in Camunda Modeler. This might seem not really optimized yet, because it's just representing what business users need to be done in our system. In the next step, we took our model and uploaded it to Kavima, as was already told before, and we granted access to Kavima to all our business users. Well, this step was really important for us because, as it turned out, during the development and during the analysis of this process, it turned out there are many open questions which weren't really solved and discussed at the workshop. So we started discussing every single element. We weren't really clear what needs to be done. And we're doing this in such an iterative approach so that we needed to make sure that everyone has a clear view of what this process, what each and every element will perform. But why we did this in Kavima? Well, basically, as you might have stumbled upon such issue, that if you're creating a system where a lot of business users or people responsible for the business flow are taking part in, it's pretty hard to gather everyone in one room. People are usually busy, and with the Kavima, it allows us to discuss it in the 3 minutes when you're taking a coffee. You can just answer a simple question in here. So When we had this model in Kavimo, we started something called the split. As it turned out during the discussions, a lot of business users don't really care how we do things in the technical layer. What I mean by this, they are just interested in the big picture of the system. They want to know how the flow goes, but they are not interested of how the external service calls are done, how resource access is made, if we have some retry mechanism, if we have something with the failure handling. They are just interested if something was done or not. Just like in the invoicing example we're doing, they were interested if the payment was received or not. Not if we have successfully communicated with Optima or if something failed internally in our system or with our communication in microservices. They just wanted to know if the payment was done to keep the big picture nice and clean. So we started spreading the process into different layers. This might seem similar to something called separation of concerns. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And we started spreading. Every single layer was represented by some sub-process call. So if in the big picture we needed to perform something by the system internally which didn't really involve any people or business itself, we had created a sub-process which calls our delegates, because we're using embedded engine in our system. We created a sub-process where it's calling the services or another sub-process which are performing some operations internally. So how did it look? In the next step, we started to implementing our processes, which were something similar to this. I'm not going to go into details of what they are doing because it's not important in this case. But you can see this is something we presented the business users as the business layer. So there are only two really user tasks which they do care about. It's filling the invoice. And then we have something for some sub-process for the processing or for the debt collection itself. Then there comes the next process, which also did some overview model. Here the business unit could see what is the progress of the debt collection for each and every case of invoice. And these two process models were basically what was really driving the business unit to progress further into our application. The rest of the sub-processes were not so interesting for them, which were some gathering some data from external services, were waiting for some particular point of time, some other decisions based on the responses from external services, some retry mechanisms. At the next step, we wanted to show the business unit that they didn't just waste time with us. And since we already had our models created and our services implemented for the communication, we decided to show them Camunda Cockpit. What we did was deploy the processes we had and create some user accounts for them so they can play around a bit with our system to see how it works, how they feel about it, and if it's something they want to go further in. And at this point, they decided that they are amazed with the flow, how it's working, but they didn't really like the Camunda task list view. So they asked us to provide something for the UI externally. So what we did, we created our own UI for the application using the Camunda REST APIs and synchronizing it with our single sign-on. And we had some simple application for the invoicing. What this application does is basically it lists all our customers, and upon our customer list, you can just create button invoice, and it will create external tasks for users to fill in the data for the invoice. And then it will monitor the payment system for the invoice payment. So what's out of this we get? Based on our experiences with this development, we created our approach. which is 5 steps approach. First of all, we decided that whenever we want to develop an application on Camunda, first we need to find the common ground. What I mean by this is we want to define the tools we're going to use. Like in case of an enterprise features, we want to use Kavimo to discuss and synchronize work with the business units. The next step is about supporting your partner. As it turned out in the first steps of our development, many of the business users didn't really know the BPM notation, so we needed to taught them how they should read it, how they should use it, how they should design it, so we can all reach a common understanding even before we start modeling the processes. So, start small, think big. As we did for this use case, we started with something really, really small, like invoicing and debt collection, which resulted in 5 or 6 processes, which weren't really that complicated. But what this tells us, for what it brings to our company, is the idea that we can develop our own tools and do not have to rely on external sources, and we can adapt our tools to the needs that are created every day in our company. Also, many of these changes that I'm talking about are also dictated by the law, especially by the tax law in basically every country. So we have here our 4th point. So improve, adapt, overcome. What we want to do here is we want to take a look at the processes we develop and how we are processing them, and think of the improvements we can make. Also, we want to discuss it with the team and the business unit, and to overcome any new challenges that are brought to our systems by the law changes, in particular in the tax field. And the last step, show us what you get. This step was introduced to perform the iterative approach of the software development. We want to make sure that every single process change or process we deploy to our system is consulted and tested first by the business users. We don't want the business users to be surprised by any changes we do, especially when we're doing the split, where we modify the process we discussed earlier and draw on the whiteboard. That doesn't look exactly the same in our system. And that's basically our approach for the software development using Camunda, which we want to enforce and use in the further developments for our next clients. So, are there any questions regarding this topic? If not, then that's basically it. We are here to talk with you. You know me, I'm Chris. There's also Jacek from RST and Oleg. You can find us anywhere around here, so you can ask additional questions. Thank you.